Okay, perfect. Well, we will talk about honeybee biology. We'll talk about it in more depth next week, but I just want to cover it a little bit more because it's a lot of information, so I want to cover this. I'll also be sending the sheet or the chapter for it for the handbook. So you guys want to read it, and I will say it has a lot of information on it. It's not like this is all required for the apprentice course. The reason I put so much information on it because I wanted to be for not only first year beekeepers, but also people that have been beekeeping for 10 years. So it's a very in-depth chapter. And so you don't have to know everything about it, but if you want to read through it and maybe have questions, for next week, just kind of write them down and shoot me an email or send in the chat next week. Okay, so we'll talk about honeybee biology, honeybee behavior, and then we'll talk about physiology a little bit next week, and just how like honeybees differ from humans. I think it's really interesting and how like bees function as sort of a social group for the betterment of the entire colony. So, like I mentioned, my name is Garrett. I'm the assistant professor and honeybee extension specialist for Texas A&M. Um, I suppose I didn't probably touch on this too much in the beginning, but I have about 25 years of experience. I'm originally from Southwest North Dakota. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm working on it. But my uncle, he was a commercial beekeeper, so he managed about 10,000 colonies. So I've been around beekeeping, especially a large scale, my entire life. And we used to ship bees to East Texas, near the Louisiana border in Marshall, Texas. So I do have some experience keeping bees in, different parts of Texas. And so today we'll talk about honeybee biology. So I'll talk a little bit about queen biology, drone biology, and then I'll touch a little bit on worker biology. We'll see if we get to it all. I might cover a little bit more of it next week. So first we'll talk about just the colonies. So, honeybees are really unique compared to other insects in that they live in these kind of large, eusocial colonies. And so if we compare them to, bumblebees that live in these smaller colonies or wasps that live in smaller colonies, honeybees live in these colonies that can have somewhere between, 5 to even 20,000 bees. And they all kind of work for the betterment of the entire colony. And the goal of these bees is to make sure the colony is, growing, surviving, and as healthy as possible. So as we'll discuss a bit more, each worker and each bee has their own kind of task, and they're in charge of feeding or nursing or taking care of the colony altogether. And so it's a really cool way that the bees behave, and one reason that bees are found in every part of the world. You can find bees in southern South America. You can find bees in Russia. And because of the way they live together in these social groups, allows them to survive in, cold weather or tropical environments. So, bees are really fascinating. And, I hope you enjoy them just as much as I do. Okay, so within a colony, we have what we like to call honeybee castes. So castes is just a really fancy way of saying there's these different types of bees within a honeybee colony. And so within a colony, we have about 10,000 bees. And I just wanted to separate a colony versus a hive. A colony are the actual bees. So the colony includes like the queen, the males, which we'll call drones, and the workers. A hive is where the colonies are living. So a hive can be sort of a man-made boxes that you purchase, or they can be in a tree or in sort of structure. So a hive is basically where the bees are living, and the colony are the actual bees in the actual colony. So within a honeybee colony, we have one queen typically. Sometimes you may see multiple queens in a colony, but 99% of the time you'll see one queen within a colony. The queen is quite a bit larger than the rest of the bees of the colony. She has this really long abdomen, which she has these large ovaries, and that allows the queen to lay somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day during the peak summer months. And her only role is to, mate and then lay eggs. And so she's the only bee within the colony that can actually lay eggs. And there's some situations where the workers can lay eggs, but that's very, very rare. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But in most cases, when you colony is healthy and strong and the queen's high quality, then the queen's only one laying eggs. In the middle, we have the males. So the males in the beacon community, we call them drones. I'm not sure the history between of calling them drones. I think because it makes kind of a low drone sound. but we call them drones for some reason. But there's maybe about 100 to 500 drones within the colony, but the colony only produces drones when there's a lot of nutrients, a lot of nectar, and a lot of pollen that they're bringing in. So when resources are really high and the colony is really strong, that's when they begin investing into the drones. Now, the drones have these large eyes, which allow them to navigate and fly to find unmated queens. They have these huge thoraxes, which are packed with flight muscles, and that allows them to go on these multiple flights and find unmated queens. And then they have these huge abdomens, which are packed with sperm organs, which allow them to produce high quality sperm during mating. Now, drones are basically only found in the colony during the summer months. When the winter hits, the colony actually evicts and kills the males. So during the winter, you may have a few males in your colony, but typically most of the males have been evicted. And then the colony begins raising drones once the nutrients are really high. Now, the majority of bees within a colony are these workers. Now, workers and queens are both female. They're genetically exactly the same and the result of a fertilized egg. But because of the nutrients that differ during development, the eggs can either become a queen, a reproductive queen, or a non-reproductive worker. Now, workers do have ovaries like queen, but they're very shriveled up, and it's very rare for a worker to actually lay eggs. And the workers actually don't have the capacity to go on mating flights. They can lay eggs, but it's under very, very rare situations. But workers are specialized for all these specific tasks within a colony. So they have these larger leg muscles that allow or legs that allow them to, collect pollen when they're collecting flowers. They have milk glands in their head that allow them to produce a jelly that they use to feed the developing larvae. They have, large proboscis, which allow them to collect nectar. So they have all these specialized features that allow them to do all the kind of hard labor and hard tasks of the colony that don't include reproduction or egg laying. And so when you think about the caste or the bees within the colony, it's going to kind of fall under these three major categories. But the majority of bees are these workers. So within the colony, bees like to set the colony in a very specific organization. Bees are very structured. They like to have things a very certain way. You can see some variation in how, these egg-laying patterns or how the bees store these nutrients. They could differ, but they're usually in this general pattern where the brood, and I'll talk about brood a little bit more, but these are the eggs, these are the larvae, and these are the pupa that are spinning a cocoon and developing into adult bees. They're typically in the middle of one of these removable frames. On the outside, we have the pollen. So you can see all these different colors. You see, purple colors, you see yellow colors, orange colors. These are all the different pollen that the bees are collecting. They basically add enzymes and sugar to ferment that pollen and turn it into what we like to call bee bread. And then on the outskirts, we have the sugar. So the bees are typically storing sugar, whether you're feeding them or the nectar that they're collecting on the outskirts of the colony. So when you start keeping bees and you start pulling out frames, you'll typically see a configuration very similar to this, where the brood is in the middle and the nutrients are on the outside of the frame. Now, within a honeybee colony, and as you start keeping bees and you buy equipment, you'll buy sort of plastic equipment typically, and the bees will build wax on this plastic foundation. And this wax is really important for honeybees. And this wax is in this hexagonal shape, and it's designed in very specific ways for the bees. So one is it's very efficient for storing nectar, and there's been some studies showing that if these cells were a certain size or they're a different shape, that they wouldn't be able to store as much honey. But because of the hexagonal shape and the way the structure of the cells are, they can store more honey than if it's a different shape or a different size. They're extremely strong and stable. So, if you look into these cells a bit more, at each of these ridges are different columns, and then there's a thin layer of wax between these columns, and that gives it a really strong and stable structure. And if you actually pull out one of those frames with the wax drawn on it and you press it, you can tell how strong that wax actually is. And it's really hard and stable for the bees, so it can last an extremely long time. One thing with this wax too is it's it's a lipid, right? It's a fat. So, if water gets on it, right, the water's not gonna get into it and ferment it. because it's a lipid, but can also, collect a lot of things from outside the area. So, once you start getting comb for the first time, it'll be kind of this really yellowish color, like this dark yellowish color. But over time, just with bee traffic and the larvae developing in it, it'll turn this really dark brown color. And it just changes that because there's this more movement. It's right, if you have a house, for example, and you buy it for the first time and your floors are really clean, and then over time, as there's more foot traffic, maybe you have kids running around, you have more dirt in the ground. That's basically what's happening with these beeswax. It starts out really clean, this yellowish color, but over time, with all the traffic and debris being brought in, it turns kind of a darker color. So if you do buy like used wax, or if you have, this wax for multiple years, it'll start changing to kind of a darkish, blackish color, but still wax. It's gonna be a little bit dirtier, and bees are really hygienic, as I'll talk about. They're really great about trying to keep the wax as clean as possible, but just because of the nature of the wax, it can turn a darker color. One thing is wax conservation. So the way they build it up, they use the least amount of wax because, as you can imagine, the bees have these wax organs in their abdomen that allow them to produce this wax. Then they use basically mandibles or hands on their face to kind of meld that wax and form it into these hexagonal cells. But because that's such an energetic process, they try to use the least amount of wax as possible. So they try to make sure this wax is stable, but yet using the less wax if possible. So the way this is structured, it's very thin wax layers on the outside, but then these columns on the five or six edges. And that's really good about temperature control. So one thing that's good about wax is it's a good way for the bees to make sure that the immature bees are warm and that the bees are able to maintain a certain temperature. Because if the temperature within a colony fluctuates a lot, that can impact brood development, that can impact the bee's ability to collect and store honey, it can impact everything related to bees. So wax is really great about controlling the temperature. And then it's really multi-purpose. So, as beekeepers, we think about wax and these hexagonal cells as storing honey, and it's really great about storing honey, but it's used for storing the pollen, it's used for the immature brood to grow and develop, and it's used for, a lot of different reasons. So it's very, very multi-purpose. Okay, so for a honeybee colony, what do honeybees need to grow and survive? The number one thing that bees need is pollen. So, bees collect pollen really mainly for their protein source. And so just like any organism or any animal, they need protein for to develop muscles. They need protein for, reproductive reasons. They need protein for everything related to their growth and development. And so pollen is where they get the protein sources. And this pollen is a really great resource because it includes not only proteins, but includes antioxidants, includes antimicrobial materials, includes vitamins. Everything that the bee needs is in this pollen. I mean, you can kind of think of it as sort of like a protein supplement, but the bees are getting it directly from the pollen. And then the nectar. So bees are going out to the flowers and they have these long tongues, which I'll show you, and they use those tongues to go inside the flower and then collect the nectar. They store it in their stomach called a honey crop, and then they fly back to the colony and then they regurgitate it back into these cells. So you can see kind of this glistening right here. This is the nectar that's been recently stored. Now, nectar has a high water content, and if you imagine if something has a high water content, then there's a possibility for that nectar to kind of ferment, has potential for it to grow microbes. So what bees typically do is they take the water out of that nectar and dehydrate it into honey. They add certain enzymes to make the honey, I guess, more antimicrobial, make it last longer. So bees are taking the nectar, which is basically a pure sugar, and adding stuff to it and lower the water content so honey can last a very long time on the shelf. And so we've all heard the stories about honey can sit on the shelf for decades and centuries. And one reason for that is the way that bees actually process that nectar into honey. Bees also need water. So, water is really important for metabolism. It's really important for growth. It's also really important for bees to keep the colony really cool. So within a honeybee colony, bees can keep that temperature at about 95 degrees. Now, as you can imagine, during these hot summer days in Texas, one way that bees can keep that that colony cool, and at the 95 degrees is by collecting water and using that to ventilate the entire colony. So water is really important for ventilation, but it's really important just for bees to consume so that they don't get dehydrated, but also used for processing the pollen and processing some of the nectar that they bring in. And then finally, propolis. So, bees go to certain plants and collect resin. A lot of these are from poplar trees, and they collect this resin and process it into propolis. Now, propolis is important for a lot of different reasons for a colony. Mainly, it's used for a glue. So, if there's any openings within the colony, like any space, the bees will use that propolis to cover up that space. So, there's not only nothing getting into the colony, no rain or water getting into the colony, but also it helps them kind of maintain the temperature. So propolis is a really great glue type product, but it also contains a lot of antimicrobials. And so it's one way for the bees to make sure that the colony is really as clean as possible and as hygienic as possible is through this propolis. And so bees will typically form these kind of propolis walls around a colony to make sure, it's as clean and as safe for the bees as possible. So basically they basically use it to make it sort of like a hospital room, right? They want to make sure it's as clean and antiseptic as possible, and propolis is a really important resource for that. Okay, so nectar. So when you first get in colonies, and we'll talk about this once you get to your first year of beekeeping, but this top frame, you can see a lot of the nectar and sugar sources stored in the cell. You can see them kind of glistening in the middle. This is, nectar that was just recently brought back, or nectar that was converted into honey. And so as bees store more and more honey or nectar into these cells, eventually become caps. So when they're full, they cap the cells into these white cappings so the bees can save that for later. Now, how do bees, convert nectar into pollen? Mainly these foragers. These are the bees, and their only job is to fly out of the colony and collect nectar and sugar research for the colony. They go out to the flowers, and they use these really long tongues to go into the flowers and collect the nectar. And so these tongues are basically kind of like a dog where they're lapping up the sugar from the flowers, and then they basically ingest that nectar and store it into a honey stomach. And this honey stomach is storing that nectar until they get back into the colony. Once they get back to the colony, the bees regurgitate that nectar um, between their hive mates. So they actually are kind of communicating with each other and spread that nectar from one bee to the next. And then they regurgitate that nectar into these cells. Now, the regurgitation is really important because the bees are adding the enzymes in the honey. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's about three important enzymes that the bees produce that are useful for processing the honey. So the bees are regurgitating that because they're adding enzymes to that honey. They're also going to process the nectar so it has lower water content. And so these enzymes are important for preservation. So one of the enzymes actually produces hydrogen peroxide that is really useful for keeping that honey um, shelf stable for extremely long time. One of those enzymes is used to break up the complex sugar into simple sugar because honey is typically glucose and fructose, but sometimes they're collecting sucrose from the colony. So these enzymes break that sucrose into simple sugars called sucrose. And so these are really important enzymes that the bees add to the nectar. And then the bees are trying to evaporate and lower the water content of that nectar so it can last longer in the cells. Because sometimes the bees need to store that honey for, weeks or months on end. And in order to do that without it kind of molding or having any microbes in it, they lower the water content to about lower than 18%. And so that's why, if you are extracting honey and you're processing honey, you want to make sure that water content's below 18%. Now, certain honeys can have a higher water content. They have certain things in the honey that can keep it shelf stable for a longer period of time. But really, the rule of thumb for most beekeepers is to try to keep it below that kind of 18% mark. But yeah, once you start opening up your colonies, you'll see some frames that have nectar like this. This is when the bees are still what we call ripening the honey. So it has that water content, it has all the enzymes. Once the honey's fully ripened and ready for the bees to store for a long period of time, it's stored in these kind of white cappings. Okay, next we have bee bread. Now, bee bread is basically pollen that's been processed and transformed by the honeybees. And as you can see, there's a lot of different colors for this bee bread. So some are purplish, some are yellow, some are orange, and this all depends on what the bees are collecting out in the field. And so the foragers are going out to the field and collecting a diversity of these different pollen sources. And as you can imagine, and one way I like to view this is, I mean, imagine if you're just eating McDonald's every single day or getting one food source every single day, you're not going to get all the nutrients you need to survive, grow, and be strong and healthy. So what bees do is they try to collect, pollen from a lot of different flowers because some flowers have pollen that have differences in protein content, some have differences in antioxidant content. So what they try to do is collect as many variety of flowers as possible. And so instead of just eating at McDonald's every single day, they're maybe going to Subway, maybe they're getting salad at the HEB. They're trying to get all these different resources. And so, that's one thing that we do recommend is having, fields and fields of wildflowers or having a variety of source for the bees to collect. So they have those different resources that can help them out. And so for this colony, for example, you can see that they're collecting pollen from all these different colors. And so I say they're collecting it from maybe 5 to 10 different flowers. And so that gives the bees the variety and the nutrients that they need to grow and survive. So bees are basically indirectly collecting pollen when they're getting nectar, and we'll talk about that during the plant biology section. But as they're sucking up the nectar, their legs are indirectly collecting this pollen. Some bees are only pollen collectors, but a lot of bees are indirectly collecting this pollen, and they store it on the back of their legs. And I'm not sure if I have a picture here, but some bees will have kind of these yellowish or purplish dots in the back of their legs. They come back and they scrape the out their back of their legs into these cells. Now, the pollen doesn't have everything the bees really need. And so what they do is they mix the pollen with nectar, so some sugar, and enzymes to really ferment that pollen into what we like to call bee bread. And so the fermentation process helps the bees break down that pollen into a source that's more nutritious for the bees and a better source for the bees altogether. And so adding these nectars and adding the enzymes to process and ferment the pollen is really important for the bees. And it really makes it just more digestible and makes the nutrients more available to the bees. And by doing that, it makes the pollen already rich source, but makes it have more sources of proteins, vitamins, and even beneficial microbes. And so this pollen has these microbes that were in the worker gut that's really helpful for future bees and other bees. Okay, so next we have propolis. So propolis is basically the really the glue of the honeybee colony, and I think a lot of beekeepers don't like propolis because it makes it really hard to open up the boxes and remove the frames. And as you see right here, this is what the propolis actually looks like. It's really sticky, and once you start your beekeeping journey, you'll notice that some bees produce a lot of propolis and makes it really hard for the colony to open and shut the colony. But for the bees, it's really important because it's a glue. So it keeps the colony closed from the outside environment. So it keeps it closed from any, pests or pathogens trying to get into the colony. It keeps it closed so they can maintain the temperature within the colony. But probably the most important part of this is it's antibiotic and has antimicrobial properties. So it can be a useful way for the bees to protect the colony from diseases. And as I'll talk about a little bit more about the immune system of honeybees actually have a very low immune system, so they're more prone to a lot of these diseases. So bees use a lot of these social behaviors and resin and propolis to protect the colony from these pests, pathogens, and diseases. And so even though a lot of beekeepers don't like working with propolis, it's really important for the whole colony. And so, yeah, I mean, one reason it maintains stable hive environment by reducing moisture or any drafts. And one way, yeah, so bees are going to the flowers and collecting, resin. So, if you do have a poplar tree or certain trees, you can see kind of that black liquid kind of coming from the trees. Those are where the bees are collecting from. But, they're mainly collecting like cottonwood trees, like those type of poplar trees. I see a lot of resin collected from them. But if you have other type of poplar trees, bees are probably collecting resin from them and then producing this to bee glue called propolis. Okay, so typically, if you're a beekeeper, you're managing colonies in these hive boxes. And in a couple weeks, we'll talk more about the configuration and type of box that you want to buy as a beekeeper. But this is what a honeybee colony typically looks like. And so each of these boxes is a separate colony. They can contain, 1,000 to 20,000 bees. And so most beekeepers try to keep the colonies off the ground. And so this beekeeper in particular had these kind of wooden 4x4 planks and set the colonies there. Some beekeepers use cinder blocks. Some beekeepers keep them right in the ground, but the problem is you can see some rotting with the wood and keep them on the ground. So a lot of beekeepers do try to keep them off the ground. They have these kind of bottom boards where they set the colonies on, and this is typically a solid or a mesh bottom board, but it's basically for bees to kind of fly in and out of. So it gives them sort of a platform to kind of fly and leave outside the colony. And then most beekeepers keep bees in these deep boxes, and so I'd say like most beekeepers in Texas keep them in double deeps. So that means these are deeper boxes, they're longer, and this is where the queen typically is. And so the queens are typically in these deep brood boxes, laying the eggs, laying the brood, and this is where all the young nurse bees are. When your colony begins producing honey and bringing in nectar and pollen, this is when beekeepers add these medium supers. Now, there isn't a difference between the deeps and medium supers. They're just smaller. And it doesn't impact how much honey they store in. It doesn't impact the bees at all. It just makes it easier for a beekeeper to lift and remove those boxes. And so if you're using, these deep boxes as honey supers, for example, they can be, hundreds of pounds. So you can imagine how heavy that is to take those honeys off. So a lot of beekeepers put these medium boxes on to make it easier to remove and process the honey from these boxes. And then we have covers and so on. But this is kind of the manage. This is typically what beekeepers manage their colonies in. There's a lot of different configurations and types of colonies. So one person mentioned in the chat the flow hive. Some beekeepers use a top bar colony. But yeah, most are keeping them in these kind of managed boxes. Now we have feral or unmanaged colonies. And so, we typically call them feral colonies, but you can call them unmanaged colonies. What that means is the honeybee colonies are living somewhere that's not managed by a beekeeper. And so, one case of that is an open air colony. So this situation where the bees are actually building a nest directly in the tree. Now this is very rare. I don't see many open air colonies, but there are situations where bees will produce comb right on a tree and start building that wax around it. The problem with this for a bee's perspective is it's not protected from the environment very well. You can see all the wax and hexagonal cells on the outside, so it's really exposed to really the environmental conditions. But this is one way that a feral colony will produce something outside a managed setting. A lot of bees, especially here in East Texas and certain parts of Texas, maybe hill country, you'll see a lot of feral managed colonies living in trees. Trees are really great homes for bees. Trees can be, pretty wide, so have a big girth. So there's a lot of room for the bees to kind of build wax and form a home. These trees can be, extremely tall, and so it gives the bees a lot more opportunity to grow and reproduce. And they're typically like one small opening where the bees can go in and out of. Sometimes you'll see kind of resin built up around there, so they make the opening a little bit smaller. But a lot of bees, especially in Texas, live in these tree cavities. And then we have structures. So in certain situations, the bees, if they're swarming or leaving a managed colony, will fly into a wall or a shed or a roof and build honeycombs. And so this is a structure that a beekeeper had in Texas. You can see the really long wax comb buildings that the bees are building. You can see all the brood that's dark in the middle. This is where the queen's actively laying eggs and building brood. And so think about feral colonies are typically these kind of three major types. But like I said, bees, if they find a home, they can build a home anywhere. Okay, so for a feral colony, and I think it's really important to understand a feral unmanaged colony to understand how we actually manage colonies, because there's a lot of things we can learn about bees in their natural environment and how we manage and how we take care of bees. And so we think about, feral or unmanaged colonies, it's really important to look at the nest locations. And so when bees are building a nest or building a hive, it's really important to have a hive that's protected from the environment and it's really protected from the wind, the water, and direct sunlight because the bees want sort of a dark location that's not as moist so you don't have many diseases, and also its ability to avoid heavy rainfalls because, I mean, just like your house, you don't want a bunch of rain. You really don't want like a roof that's, has a hole in it so rain's getting into your house. Bees are exactly the same way. They want to make sure that there's no rain or sunlight getting directly into their house. And so, some bees will build a nest into a tree, and if there is some opening in it, they'll close up with propolis or resin, but they really want to find a nest that's protected from all these environmental variables that could impact their home. Typically, they prefer enclosed cavities with really small entrances. So if the entrance is too big, that allows more rain, more weather to get into the colony and impact their temperature control. So they prefer, smaller entrances in general. And so, typically, I mean, this is a pretty big entrance, but you don't see entrances any bigger than this. They're typically a lot smaller than this. The cavity size, so how big is the actual nest inside one of these structures or um, trees. The preferred nesting size is really between 20 and 100 liters. They don't like cavities too small because there's lack of space for the bees to grow and build a larger colony. And so you typically don't see native colonies or feral colonies that are less than 20 liters, but you don't see any that's larger than 100 liters because it can be really hard for the bees to keep that warm and keep it temperature controlled. But most of them are around 40 liters, which is similar to a Langstroth colony. So, the pie box I was referring to, it's about the same size as that. So beekeepers have really used these 40 liters to build Langstroth colonies and have managed colonies that are as similar as possible to some of these unmanaged colonies. And so, a lot of people when you started figuring out how to, and we'll talk about this more in the history section, but how to make managed colonies that are as similar to unmanaged colonies as possible. The one thing they refer to is a bee space. So, when bees are building wax, there's a certain space between the wax, so the bees can easily move in and out, but also they won't build wax that's connecting the two. So this bee space is really important. And we talk about removable frames within a honeybee colony. They typically have that bee space, so it's not too wide, but it's not too close to each other. And this bee space, and this is something that you should remember, is this 3/8 of an inch. And then one thing with man-made hive designs is adjustable entrances. So making sure the entrance isn't too large, it's a good size, but also capacity to reduce the entrance when it gets too cold so the bees can better maintain the temperature. And so we've learned, over the past 200 years about, these natural nesting sites and how we can apply those natural nesting sites to a managed honeybee colonies. And that's one reason that we see a lot of these alternative hive management styles is because beekeepers are trying to replicate what bees are doing in the natural environment. So this is the really the bee space. So we'll talk about more about this about getting started in beekeeping, but within a typical hive box, there's these 8 to 10 removable frames. So this allows you to remove the frame, inspect the colony, but also pull the frames out to extract and remove the honey for bottling. And the way these removable frames are designed and set up is to have this bee space. So nothing less than 1/4 of an inch, but nothing more than 3/8 of an inch. Because if you have more than that, you'll see bees start building a bunch of combs in the middle of that to really get rid of that space and have that bee space. But if you have less than 1/4 of an inch, then the bees are unable to move and move between frames. And so it's really important to have between 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. But this is something you have to worry about. Because these frames are already designed that way. But if you are inspecting colonies or removing frames, making sure that the frames aren't too far apart. So when you're inspecting colony and putting frames back into the colony, it's really important to make sure the frames are as close together as possible to make sure you maintain that bee space. Because if you don't, you'll see a lot of what we like to call bird comb built in the middle, and that'll cause issues with your management. And we'll show some pictures of that later on. Okay, so within a honeybee colony, we have different cell types. So we have worker cells, we have queen cells, and we have drone cells. So worker cells are basically the typical hexagonal cells. So these are the same size as cells that bees use to store pollen, that bees use to store the honey and nectar. That's exactly the same cell size that they use to store the young developing brood. So these are worker cells. Now, workers and queens are exactly the same, but based on what they receive during development, a bee can either become a queen or a worker. Now, one way that bees make a queen out of one of these larvae is by making these really long queen cells. And so, as you can imagine, this is a typical worker cell, and this is a queen cell. You can see it's probably 10 to 20 times bigger than the worker cells. So that means is the workers can give them more food and allow that worker to get bigger and become a reproductive queen. And so these are queen cells and they're quite a bit bigger than the worker cells. Now they're actually not built out like a worker cell, they're built down because they're so long. And so you'll see these cells kind of built down along the face of the frame. And then we have drone cells. So these drone cells are a little bit bigger than the worker cells, but still smaller than the queen cells. So you can see this is a drone cell, and these are the worker cells. So it's a little bit bigger than the worker cells. It's a little bit because the drones are about 2 to 3 times bigger than the workers. And so these are really the three major cell types for the developing bees. Okay, so now colony throughout the seasons, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the year in beekeeping. But it's really important to understand the four stages of development and four life stages for a honeybee colony. And so right now we're in this kind of stage one, this November, January stage. This is kind of the colony dormancy phase. I know last week we had some really warm weather. The bees were collecting pollen, so they started getting into that stage two phase. But this is kind of the overwintering stage where the bees are forming the clusters. They're forming these kind of warm overwintering balls to keep them through these kind of harsh winters. Once the temperatures get really warm, so above 55 degrees, when there's pollen available and nectar available, the queen will start laying eggs again. So there'll be more brood in the colony, and then that'll cause the colony to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so stage two is really this kind of population increase stage where the colonies are going from dormancy to beginning to increase and increase. Oh, and actually, I would just focus on the black line. We'll talk about these different lines later on, but just focus on the black line because this is the colony growth state. And then, as they grow and they really reach their maximum colony size around July and August here in Texas. And so this is when the colony gets to 10 to 20,000 bees. This is when they're unable to get much bigger, and this is when they reach their maximum size. And this is also when beekeepers are typically removing the honey supers, pulling the honey, and then extracting the honey and then processing it. And then after August, September, October, this is when the colony size begins to decrease and get prepared for the winter. And so, workers are kind of changing from summer bees to winter bees. The bees are starting to hoard more honey to make it through the winter. So they're really preparing for the winter. And because of that, really need less bees. So if you have a colony of 20,000, bees, that's a lot of bees for the colony to keep warm and keep alive throughout the winter. So the bees have to get to a certain size to make it easier and have the resources available to make it through the winter. And then it repeats the process once again where the colony enters dormancy phase. And so each bee year, a colony will go through these four stages from one to four. Okay, so next I'll talk a bit about development for honeybees. So honeybees are holometabolists. And what that means is that they're very similar to butterflies. And they go from a grub stage or larva stage, which looks like this, and they transform all their bodies and all their tissues to become a bee. So as you can imagine, this larva looks a lot different than an adult bee. And this whole metabolist, just thinking about it, it's really important because these are basically modified guts. And so I'll talk about the anatomy of a larva, but it's basically one big gut, and that allows the larva to consume a lot of food and grow as fast as possible. And so these larvae are really designed to eat as much food as possible and grow as fast as possible. Now, honeybee colonies go through really four major stages. So the first stage is this egg. And if you can see right here, I mean, it's really small. These eggs look like the size of a grain of rice, so they're extremely small. And as you're getting to your first year of beekeeping, it may be hard to kind of find these eggs, but as you get more experience and as you look more frames, you'll be able to identify what an egg looks like. And the egg takes about 3 days to hatch. Now, the queen has an option of laying either an unfertilized egg or a fertilized egg. The fertilized egg will become a female, so either a queen or a worker. Typically, a worker if the colony already has a queen. If a queen lays an unfertilized egg, that will always become a male. So that's one way that bees regulate whether a bee becomes a male or a female is through the fertilization of the egg. Now, regardless if it's fertilized or unfertilized, the egg will hatch after 3 days into what we like to call first instars. Now, when we think about development for honeybees, we call them instars because this is when bees are actually molting. So they're molting from one stage to the next. Now, honeybee larvae go through 5 stages of molting. So from first instar, which are really small, about the size of an egg, to the fifth instar, which are extremely large and almost look as they're overflowing the cells. And so at this stage, they've already gone through 5 molts. And so as a beekeeper, you won't be able to see the molts, because the molting skin that the bees are the larvae are peeling off are basically invisible and get degraded right away, but they are molting their skin and growing to a um, different size. And so one way they regulate this is through hormones. And so as they're growing, they have one hormone and when they're ready to molt, that hormone dips down and they're able to molt to the next stage. So like I said, there's 5 stages of, instars or bee molting. This is an example of a first instar. I know it's kind of hard to see, but this larva is about the size of an egg. This is what a second instar looks like. And so it's a little bit bigger. You can start seeing it a bit better. This is a third instar, so it's about half the size of a large larva, fourth instar, and then fifth instar. And so, understanding these different instars will be really important if you do decide to raise your own queens, or, you're colonies queenless and you need to raise your queens, because the only way that a colony can raise new queens is if the larvae are below second instar. So if your colony is queenless and all your larvae are, fourth instar and above, then your colony is unable to raise the queens. So understanding the instars, understanding the size of the larva is really important for your colony's ability to raise new queens. Okay, so once they reach this fifth instar, what they do is they basically defecate. So they remove all that feces and that urine from their bodies, and then they spin a cocoon. And they spin a cocoon, and then they're capped under these wax cappings for the next really week or so. And so basically for the first 5 days, from the first instar to fifth instar, they're not defecating at all until they're actually purging their gut and then entering this pupa stage. Now, what's under this wax capping? We have pre-pupa, so these are basically larvae. And so what they do is they become kind of upright in this. So instead of back here, instead of being kind of in the C shape, they move to this elongated shape where they're facing up. And you can't see right here, but they actually have a cocoon spun around this pupa stage. And so you can't see the cocoon, but they're similar to a butterfly where they're actually spinning cocoon. Once that cocoon hatches, they become what we like to call a pupa stage. So this is when they're basically shifting from one form, this larva stage, all the way to a different form where it looks like a pupa stage. And the first stage of pupa development is this white-eyed stage. So this is when the skin's very tender and it's very really really soft, and so that's why there's a lot of damage that can happen during this stage because their tissue's still melanizing, hardening up, so they can be adult bees that can be protected. And they have sort of this white-eyed. Over time, the eyes start melanizing, the skin starts to darken and harden, and they go from a pink-eyed stage into a purple-eyed stage. So you can see the melanization in the eyes and then eventually melanization in all their skin tissue. And this is allows them to be more protected when they kind of emerge as adult. And what they're developing is what we like to call chitin. Chitin is a really hard skin that the bees use, and it protects them from really the outside environment. So it's a really protective exoskeleton that the bees have that protects them from really everything. And then they basically emerge as an adult bee. And so, yeah, for development, I guess the workers take 21 days to develop from an egg all the way to an adult. The queens take 16 days, and the drone takes 24 days. So there's differences in how long it takes these different casts to get from an egg all the way to an adult. Oh, and also I should mention, so if they are on the queen track, for example, at this stage they're starting to develop all the ovaries and the large ovaries and the reproductive tissue that the queens need to lay eggs, whereas the workers have shriveled up ovaries and they're developing kind of these long tongues right here. They're developing, these bigger legs, corbiculates that allow them to collect pollen. So they're developing more specialization for a worker, whereas the queens would be developing specialization for a queen, for example. Okay, so now for egg anatomy. So like I mentioned, the egg takes 3 days to hatch once it's laid, regardless if it's an unfertilized egg, which becomes a male, or a fertilized egg, which becomes a female. So this egg has this really hard exo protective layer called a chorion. This chorion is really hard, and we've actually tried to cryopreserve these embryos before, and it's really hard because that chorion is a really strong structure and it protects the egg from everything. but it's structured in a way because it allows oxygen to get into the egg because the egg needs oxygen to kind of for the embryo to grow and eventually hatch into a larva. I mean, it's really not any different than just like a typical egg that you buy at the grocery store. Eggs have the kind of dark or really the hard skeleton called the chorion, the shell of the egg. So it's basically exactly the same. Not as hard, but it's kind of similar concept. And then inside there's a yolk. So just like any regular egg has a yolk that is basically the nutrients for the embryo. So this yolk has all the protein and the nutrients the egg needs to grow and then eventually hatch. So, like I mentioned, fertilized eggs, so ones that are fertilized by a sperm become a female, and ones that are unfertilized, so they're not fertilized by a sperm, become a male. And then they take 3 days to develop. And so, one thing with new beekeepers, it's really easy to see the eggs if you have this dark black comb. As you can even see from this picture, you can see the eggs pretty clearly on the black cells. And so, that's one thing that makes it easier to see the eggs. If you have kind of this light comb, it can be harder to see the eggs. I know these are close-up pictures, but when you get into the colony and trying to find eggs for the first time, it can be really difficult for the untrained eye. So it does take a lot of experience. But, if you do have eggs, you have an active laying queen. So that's one sign you have a queen. So once you get into inspections and you start looking for whether you have a queen or not, it's not really important if you find the queen all the times. It's important if you see eggs. Because if there's eggs that look like this, then there's a queen. And these eggs are basically glued at the bottom of the cell, and then they'll eventually hatch. And so this is actually a larva right here. So this queen actually laid two eggs. So this is a really small larva. As you can see, it's not that much bigger than an egg. It's extremely small. Okay, so now we get into the larva. So like I mentioned, these larvae go through 5 instars, so 5 different molts. And really the anatomy of the larva is it's basically a giant gut, a giant digestive system. So this is really what the larva looks like, but you can see most of it's actually this gut. And so larvae are different than, worker bees or queen bees in that they're soft. So if you actually pull them up, they're very soft and tender, and they don't have that really hard exoskeleton. They don't have legs, so they basically crawl to their food, and they're really focused on feeding and growing because the foods that they receive during development really sets how big the bees are going to be. So the larva's goal is to eat as much as possible and grow as much as possible to reach at the size that they actually need. Now they're fed a nutrient-rich jelly by the nurse bees. Now this jelly you can view as sort of the milk for the bees. They're produced in the glands of the head, and that this jelly or this milk has the proteins, it has the sugars, it has the antioxidants, everything that the bees need. So you can view it as sort of like baby milk for the developing bees. Now, digestive system, there's 3 major parts of the digestive system. We have the foregut, so this small section right here. So this is when the food first enters the gut. And then we have the midgut right here. So this is the largest portion of the gut. You can view this as sort of the large intestine relative to humans, whereas the foregut's more like the stomach of the bees. And then we have the hindgut, which is really the part that's going to be basically converting that into nutrients. But actually, for larvae, the midgut and foregut are together, but the midgut is not attached to the hindgut, and because of that, the bees are consuming all these nutrients, but they're not basically defecating or get rid of any of that waste. They're actually storing it until they actually enter pupation, and so that's one reason that the guts aren't together. And then we have, let's see, pull this up here. We have the tubules. So actually, I'll talk about respiration quick. So honeybees don't have lungs. What they have is they have small holes on their bodies called spiracles. And so larva has 10 on each side or 20 on each side. And these spiracles are hard holes that can open and shut that allow oxygen to get back into the body, but allows them to close up so they don't get dehydrated or allow anything to get out. So they have these small spiracles kind of along their bodies. And these tubules are connected to all their tissues so they get oxygen from the air all the way to all these tissues to really function. So it's a different system than humans where bees don't have lungs, they have these spiracles. Then they have these silk glands. So these silk glands, once they finish the larva stage, these silk glands produce silk that allow them to spin a cocoon and then get into this cocoon stage. And actually, I should say this pupa anatomy, not egg anatomy. I just realized that. And then we have pupil anatomy. So at this stage, the pupil looks exactly like an adult bee. So all the features. Really, the only difference is the tissue is still kind of hardening up and melanizing. The eyes are still developing. So they, even though they look very similar to a bee, where they have, the head, they have the thorax, and they have the abdomen, they're still developing and their skin's still melanizing. And so at this stage, their legs are actually finally formed. So they have six legs that are attached to their thorax. And so they have the six legs. Then you can start seeing the abdominal segments. So there's different segments that allow the bees to kind of move their butts in and out. And so this is one hard structure. They wouldn't be able to have any movement with the thorax. And this will be really important because these segments are really important for wax production because the wax are excreted outside of these segments. It's really important for breathing for them. So it needs to open and shut for breathing, but it's really important for their navigation, so the ability to move around. So that's one reason they have these different segments on their abdomen. Their digestive system is fully connected to the food processing and waste expulsion. So similar to larvae, well, actually, they're actually not feeding on this stage. So they're in pupa stage. They're not feeding at all. They're just developing. So they're not, taking in any nutrients at all. But at this stage, their whole gut starts combining together, so it's not separated. So when they do emerge as an adult, they can actually start feeding and excreting any waste. Now, yeah, then there's eye melanization, so the eyes are developing, so they're transitioning from white stage to a purple and black stage. And then we get to reproductive development. So this is actually a picture of a male. And so they have the testes, seminal vesicles, so all the reproductive tissue for males. But this was a queen, then their ovaries will begin bigger, their ability to lay eggs, all these organs will begin bigger for the queen. And then we have workers, so they're non-functional ovaries. They do have ovaries, but they're very shriveled up. So workers really only have the capacity to lay maybe 10 eggs per day if they can lay eggs, whereas work queens can lay, 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day. Okay, so now talk a little bit about queens. Okay, so recently, beekeepers have been experiencing extremely high losses, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that, we have been dealing with for, about 20 years or so. And when you think about why bees are dying, the number one driver is, varroa mites. So varroa mites are contributing to about 45% of losses. Viruses are contributing to 20%. So, as beekeepers and as new beekeepers, this is something that you want to closely monitor and manage effectively. And so as we get into the disease section and the varroa management section, we'll talk more about the viruses and the varroa. But one of the major drivers is queen failure. So, as you imagine, if you don't have a queen in your colony or the queen starting to fail or be replaced, then you don't have more eggs in your colony. Your colony's going to start getting smaller, and your colony could crash if it's unable to raise a new queen. So, queens are extremely important for honeybees' growth, survival, and really its ability to persist year in, year out without dying at the end of the year. And so, queens are really important for a honeybee colony. So, why are queens important? The number one reason is their colony genetics. And so, we hear about genetics all the time, but this is sort of the genetic code that the bees use to make traits. And so half the genetics within your colony are from the queens. And that's why it's really important to find a high quality queen with the traits that you're looking for. So if you're buying a queen for honey production, you want to make sure that queen is bred and selected for honey production. But if you want a queen that has viral resistance, it's important to have a queen that has those genetic traits. And so the colony genetics is really important for the queen because half the genetics is actually directly coming from the queen. But probably their most important role is this egg laying. So queens are the only one that can lay eggs. There might be some situations where you have a two queen system, where you have multiple queens in a colony, but that's very rare. Even if you do have two queens in the colony, if they do run into each other, then one queen will try to kill the other queen. So usually those two queen systems don't last very long unless there's separation. But these queens are really important for egg laying because they can lay, 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day during peak summer months. And so their ability to produce eggs and lay eggs is extremely important. And then sperm storage. So as I get into kind of the mating behavior of queens, the ability to fly out and find males, they actually only leave the colony early in their life. And so what they do is they go on these multiple mating flights. They mate with these males and they store the sperm in this sperm storage organ, and then they'll use that sperm to lay unfertilized eggs for the rest of their life. And so they'll never leave the colony unless it's under certain situations. And so their ability to find males and store their sperm for, 2 to 4 years is extremely important. And then we have colony traits. That's the same with colony genetics. If your queen has certain genetics, then your colony will have certain traits. And so as a new beekeeper, there may be some things that you're looking for. You may be looking for colonies that produce a lot of honey, but maybe you're looking for colonies that are just resilient and strong and can survive throughout the year. And so having queens that are resilient and are selected for those traits is really important to have the expression of the traits and have your colonies live and survive for longer periods of time. But pheromones are probably the most important part of a queen. So queens produce these pheromones, which are very specific scents, and these scents tell the colony a lot about what's happening. So the queens are producing pheromones that, one, tell the workers that there's a strong reproductive queen within the colony. And so younger queens produce a QMP pheromone or queen mandibular pheromone that tells the bees that there's a healthy young queen. But as that queen ages, that pheromone wears off and the workers can sense that. So as that pheromone wears off, then that tells the workers like, hey, this queen's getting older. We need to replace that queen and raise a new queen. So that pheromone is really important for telling the workers about how well the queen's doing. It's also really important for just colony cohesion altogether, because if there's a queen in the colony, the workers are collecting the pheromone from the queen and distributing that to the rest of the colony members. Because as you can imagine how big a colony is, all the workers may not be exposed to the queen pheromone. So the workers that are going to the queen, collecting that pheromone, are distributing it throughout the colony. So the colony knows, hey, there's a queen in the colony and it's doing very well. And then also there's a pheromone that tells the workers that they need more nutrients. So as the queen starts ramping up and starts laying more eggs, they produce a pheromone to alert the rest of the bees that there's an activating queen and the eggs and larvae need more nutrients. And so that tells the workers to, fly out, collect more pollen, collect more nutrients to sustain the larva and the growth of the colony. So we'll talk about pheromones a bit more probably next week, but these pheromones are really important, and there's a lot of different pheromones, and that's one way that bees communicate with each other and tell the colonies and the bees how well the colony is actually doing. So this is a typical life cycle of a honeybee queen. So during development, the queen takes 16 days from egg all the way to adult to develop. And workers take 21 days and drones take 24 days. So queens actually, even though they're quite a bit larger than the rest of the bees, they develop really rapidly and really quickly. And so understanding these 16 days will be really important if you ever decide to raise your own queens, knowing how long it takes, because the worst thing to do is raise a bunch of queens and those queens develop and kill the rest of the queens. So understanding the 16 days is really important. So for a queen, right, they go through these four stages of development, from an egg to a larva to a pupa and then to an adult stage. But this stage is really important for a queen because they're developing larger queen cells. So their ovaries are getting bigger, so they can lay 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day. So this ovary development is really, really important. Their ability to produce pheromones, so their glands are getting bigger for the queens, and they have different specialized structure that allow them to reproduce and really do all the queen-like tasks within a colony. After they emerge as a queen, they spend the first couple days kind of getting a feel for the area, their hair is kind of wearing off, so they're really getting ready for the next stage of development. But after a few days, the queen will go on these multiple mating flights and mate with a drone. So we like to call these unmated queens. And the queens will fly out and go to these areas known as drone congregation areas. And these are areas where the drones are sitting and waiting for a queen to arrive. Once the queen arrives, the drones will form these massive drone comets, chase after the queen, and the queen will mate with somewhere between 15 to 20 of these males. And so the queen is doing all their mating really for the first, few days to few weeks of their lifespan. Now, once they mate with these 15 to 20 males, they'll take that sperm and store it in a sperm storage organ called the spermatheca. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And basically, they'll never leave the colony again. They'll have all the sperm they need. They have the capacity to lay eggs, and they'll lay eggs for the rest of their lifespan. And the queen's lifespan can last somewhere between a year to 4 years. There's been some reports that queens can live up to 7 years, but I really wouldn't bet on it, After a couple years, the queens usually get old and get replaced by the workers. So on average, I say a queen lives about 1.5 years, but they can live up to 4 years. But it really depends on, their ability to produce a really great pheromone for the workers, but also the ability to store high quality sperm for the rest of their lifespan. So here's a little bit more about development. So, like I said, there's these two stages during development, right? Egg to larva to pupa stage. Now, ovary development is occurring during this larval instar. So once they reach kind of the fifth larval instar or their fifth molt, this is when the ovaries are developing and getting bigger. Then their ovaries, once they become this pupa stage, just being a cocoon, is fully developed and they're ready to become an adult. And then once they're pupa, and this is actually a drone, I need to get a new queen picture, but it basically says that this is a reproductive tissue, it's growing, it's developing into the sperm, or not sperm organs, but the reproductive organs for the queen. And like I said, during development, because the workers are receiving less nutrients, these ovaries don't get as big in workers. They do have ovaries, but they tend to be shriveled up and disintegrated. So instead of having the capacity to lay thousands of eggs per day, the capacity maybe lay 10 to 20 eggs per day. Okay, so with bees, they have this system known as caste determination. So what that means is an unfertilized egg has capacity to become either a queen or a worker. So queens and workers are genetically exactly the same and result of a fertilized eggs, but depending on the nutrients and the food that they receive during development, they become either a queen or a worker. So it's a really fascinating system that not only honeybees have, but also some ant species have this caste determination, where the females are genetically the same, but they have different structures and specializations. So once this fertilized egg hatches and the larva is fed, this larva, if it's young enough, so a first or second day or instar larva, has the capacity to become either a queen or a worker. So in a situation where the colony doesn't have a queen anymore, then the workers will pick out a few of these larvae and then make their cells a lot bigger and raise these larvae into queens. And so this is what a typical worker cell looks like. So it's quite a bit smaller and allows the workers to restrict the food and make sure that the larvae are small and don't develop as big as a queen. But in situations where the colony wants to raise a queen, they raise these huge queen cells that are, 10 times larger than a worker cell. And that allows them to put more food into the cell. That allows the larva to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then develop ovaries and specialized structures for a queen. So, because the food is restricted and the workers are restricted during development, these workers have specialized anatomy that allows them to do all the worker-like tasks that don't involve reproduction. Whereas the queens are in these large queen cells that allow them to specialize in tasks related to reproduction and egg laying. And so really the only difference is the amount of food they receive during development. It's a really simple system, but it's one way that workers can determine a queen or a worker. Okay, so when you think about caste determination, what determines that? Bees feed the developing larva what we like to call royal jelly. This royal jelly is produced in the glands in the worker head, and we'll talk more about these glands tomorrow, but these glands produce like a milk-like structure for the bees. Now, this jelly, looks right here, this is the queen cell. It's very viscous, it's very thick. And so if you actually pull it up, it won't be kind of runny like milk. It'll be kind of a thick, gelatinous jelly. And this jelly, similar to milk, has everything that the developing baby immature larvae need. So it has all the proteins, it has different types of sugar, has water, lipids, and then other micronutrients from the plant. Sometimes the bees will actually put pollen in here to, give some more protein to the larva, but most of the time it's, produced in the milk gland in the head and regurgitated to the developing, workers or queens. Now, there's some talk about like royal jelly is only fed to queens, but really royal jelly is very similar to queens versus workers. It's a little bit different. So, the royal jelly fed to the queen is higher quality, so it has, more proteins and less sugar, whereas the jelly fed to the workers has less protein and more sugar, but it's essentially exactly the same. The only difference is the queens are just fed a lot more food. So they're fed, you know, 3 to 4 times more food than the workers. That allows them to get bigger and develop into a queen and have more specialization to a queen. So here's a little bit more about an adult queen anatomy. So eventually, once we get the handbook finished, we'll have a better hand-drawn picture. I see a graphical designer to make it for me, but this is a photo in some of the handbooks I've read. I think it's a really great, simple illustration of what a queen reproductive tract actually looks like. And so queens have these two ovaries. So as you can see in the yellow, so here's one ovary, and here's the ovary on the other side. In the middle, you see all these stripes right here. These are what was called ovarials. So the eggs are actually produced at the tip of these ovarials. They develop as they go down these ovarials, and then once the egg is large and fully developed, it goes through the oviduct. This egg travels through the oviduct until it reaches the spermatheca. So spermatheca is where the sperm is actually stored. So as the egg is passing through the oviduct and pass through the spermatheca, the queen decides whether to fertilize it or not fertilize it. So if a queen wants to lay a drone, they won't fertilize it with spermatheca, so they close off the spermatheca so the sperm can't fertilize the egg. But if the queen wants to lay either a future queen or a worker, they open up the spermatheca, the sperm travels down and fertilizes the egg. Then it passes through the vagina and then through the oviduct and laid into to the cell. And so you have to know like all these different terms, but just know that we do have an ovary, different ovarials that are actually producing eggs. They travel through the oviducts, and then the spermatheca was actually fertilizing and not fertilizing the egg. Now, if you actually dissect a queen, the the intestinal tract will be really right through the ovaries. So you'll actually see both the reproductive tract and the intestinal tract kind of scrunch together, and actually a lot of times it travels in between the two ovaries. And so this includes like the guts and the hind guts and where the queen actually expels any waste. And so where the queen lays eggs and where they expel waste are actually in the same area. Now, queens actually do also have a stinger. So the stinger is right below where the oviduct is and where the reproductive tract is. But the queens actually don't have a barbed stinger. So that means the queens can sting you multiple times without dying, whereas the workers have a barbed stinger. So once they sting you, they die after stinging. Now, queens don't typically sting you. I've been stung by a queen a few times. It doesn't hurt that much. It's very, very rare. But if they do happen to sting you, then the queen won't die, but I wouldn't be too worried about it. I've rarely seen it happen. Okay, so a little bit more about honeybee mating. So queens typically mate with going on one or two mating flights. They uh they really want to go on more mating flights than that because if they go on more mating flights, they risk predation. So they expose themselves to the weather. They expose themselves to like birds, like kingbirds, or just they really like queens. So if you have a lot of kingbirds in your area, they will be flying after the queens and eating them. So queens typically like to go on one or two of these mating flights. During these flights, they'll mate with multiple drones. So 12 to 20 of these drones. And so basically they'll mate with a drone, and then once that mating's over, they'll store their sperm into the spermatheca, then go off to mate with another drone. Now, I will say on average, it's 12 to 20, but queens can mate with 250 to 60 drones. I've seen some studies showing that. So, it really depends on the area, depends on your weather. So if your queen's flying out and the weather's really poor, it's really raining, they may mate with less than 12 males, but the weather's really great, the temperature's great, then the queen's mate with more males. So it really depends. It also depends on how many males are in the area where your queen's mating. So, queens are mating in these drone congregation areas where there's thousands of drones sitting there and waiting for a queen to arrive. And they can have somewhere between 1,000 to 20,000 males. So if there's more males, like 20,000, and they're trying to mate with one queen, the queen's obviously going to mate with more males. But if it's an area where there's not a lot of drones, the queen may mate with less males. So really, it's temperature dependent and depending on how many drones are in the area. And here's a video of the mating flight. And so you see here's a queen flying up. This is somewhere in Switzerland. It's a very, very old video, but I think it illustrates it. You see all these kind of drones right here waiting for queen. They're forming these drone comets, and this queen's flying, and these two drones are kind of fighting after each other, kind of knocking each other out of the way to find the queen. And this drone was able to latch onto the queen, and then start inseminating the queen. So the drone's actually passing on sperm to the queen. Then they both become paralyzed in the air and they fall, feet out of the air. The drone's reproductive tract is ripped out, and the drone dies after mating. So a drone can only mate once in their lifespan. See, it's falling to the ground.
When the queen turns from her mating flight, it keeps 5 million.
Yeah, so the queen can only mate once, or the drone can only mate once, but the queen will mate with 15 to 20 of these males. So those continue on these mating flights, mate with multiple males. But as you can imagine how competitive this environment is, you have, one queen to, like 20,000 males. So it's a really male-centric mating area. Okay, so what does honeybee queen mating number depend on? So I talked about this a little bit more, but number one is weather. So a lot of beekeepers, you're probably buying queens or bees from East Texas or some parts of Texas. Um, and they really start producing bees probably in late February, early March. And so weather can be extremely variable here in Texas. And so weather is playing a really important role in how well that queen mates and how successful that queen mates. So, with queens, you want them to mate with as many males as possible and have a higher mating quality. But mating also depends on pathogens. So, bees have diseases or pathogens. Queens actually mate with more males because it's one way for them to combat some of these diseases. Parasites, nutrition, and then ways you treat your mite levels can impact queens. So there's a lot of things that impact mating quality. Now, as a first-year beekeeper, you're not really worried about mating quality or how well your queens mate. I mean, you want them to mate well, but you're not controlling that at all. But this is one reason that your queens may fail after 1 year, or they may be healthy and strong for over 4 years because they're not mating as well, and the mating impacted their ability to find enough males and store that sperm for long periods of time. Okay, so here's a little bit more about egg laying. So this is a spermatheca organ. And, if you ever have any extra queens, or maybe your queen's failing and you're going to replace her anyways with a new queen, you can actually easily dissect the spermatheca and see how much sperm is actually stored and how well that sperm is stored. And so this is what a healthy, well-mated queen spermatheca actually looks like. You can see it's kind of this crystal ball, with this white crystal ball where you can see all the sperm in the middle of the spermatheca. And this is kind of a clear crystal ball where this is an unmated queen and there's no sperm in the spermatheca. So this is what it looks like with a well-mated queen versus an unmated queen. So here's kind of a better anatomical view of the queen. So you can see the ovaries, the oviduct, and then the spermatheca. So as the eggs are produced in the ovaries, past the oviduct, they can be fertilized by the sperm or not fertilized and become a male. So, healthy queen, like I said, can lay upwards to 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per day during peak season. Obviously, now if you do have bees and your queens are laying eggs, they're not laying that many. It depends on how many nutrients are around, but really around May, June, July, your queens will probably be laying quite a few eggs per day. Like I said, the queen controls whether the egg is fertilized or not. So the queen decides if they want to lay a male or a female. But I will say, as queens get older and as they run out of sperm, queens will be forced to lay unfertilized eggs. So if you start seeing a mixture of workers and drones on your cell, like in the middle of the cell, that's a good sign that your queen might be failing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more about signs of failing queens. And then if the queen's egg laying capacity diminishes, then her pheromones are diminishing, and the colonies can sense that, and they attempt to replace the queen with a new queen. So one way to visualize a high quality queen and a healthy queen is by simply the brood pattern. And we'll talk a lot bit more about this during colony inspections, but with a queen, you want to make sure you have a very, very solid brood pattern. So what that means is the queen's not missing many spots. And so this is a really great brood pattern. On my scale, I rate this at a 5 out of 5. So this is a really great looking queen. There's a few missing spots, but that's pretty normal. Now, I will say that this isn't the best indicator because sometimes it can be pollen, so the queen has no place to lay. But if your queen does have a really solid brood pattern like this, it's a good sign that you have a good, high quality queen. Now, if you see kind of a shoddy brood pattern or a spotted brood pattern like this, but the one thing to note here is you see these drone cells. These drone cells are right next to the worker cells. Now, all queens, healthy queens, will lay drones, but the healthy queens won't lay spotty drones with the workers in the middle of the brood frame. So if you start seeing a lot of drone cells and a lot of worker cells in the middle of your frame, that's a good sign that the queen's failing and running out of sperm. Now, if you just see the queen laying drones, if you just see the queen's laying drones on the outskirts of the colony and there's not workers next to it, then that's a sign that the queen's healthy. So it's really important to kind of know the difference between a healthy and a poor brood pattern. It's not the end all be all, but it can be a sign that your queen's failing, and you might want to allow the colony to replace that queen or a queen with your own colony or your own queen. One way is so if you start seeing that spotty brood pattern, you start seeing a lot of drones produce. One way to see if the queen's doing well or not doing well is to just see if she's damaged or not. And so if I start seeing a poor brooder pattern like this, one thing I'll do is try to find the queen and see how well she looks because the workers will form like a clear retinue around the queen and take care of her, especially if she's young and doing very well. And her wings will be clearly structured like this, so it won't be tattered and she'll really be healthy looking. But once she starts getting damaged, and once the workers try to replace her, they start kind of biting at her wings and start chewing after her, and they won't form the clear retinue around the queen. So this is actually the same queen from this cell. So I found this body brood pattern. I saw a lot of drones being produced, and I found the queen, and I saw that half her wing was chewed off. Her other wing had chew on it. The workers are kind of grabbing at her and chewing at her, and this sign that the workers are trying to replace the queen and get a new queen in the colony. And so next thing to look at is the retinue. Now, this isn't always the best sign because if you over smoke your colonies, then the workers will disperse. You won't see this clear retinue. But if you just give like a few light smokes of smoke and you inspect the colony and find the queen, you'll typically see 10 or so workers surrounding the queen and tending to the queen. And this is what we like to call a retinue. So queens, especially healthy queens, should always have a clear retinue of workers taking care of her, feeding her, grooming her, and taking care of her all together. And so if you see this retinue, the queen's looking good and the brood pattern's looking good, that's a good sign that the queen has a lot of really high quality sperm stored and she's doing a great job that the workers approve of. This son of a failing queen, so you can see there isn't any attendance around the queen. Her wings are a bit tattered and chewed at. The workers aren't very pleased with her. I just had some queen cells, so the workers are trying to replace that queen. So, but you might see this even with a healthy queen, because if you over smoke it, the bees will kind of run off and they won't be tending towards her. But this could be a sign that something's wrong with your queen. Next thing is to look at queen cells. So, like I mentioned, if something happens to the queen, so the queen's failing or the queen's dead, then the workers will frantically try to raise a new queen. And so this is a situation where a beekeeper accidentally killed their queen. And so this is what we like to call emergency queen cells. So the workers basically raise 10 or 20 queen cells as fast as possible because once those larvae reach a certain age, there's no way for that colony to raise a new queen unless you as a beekeeper puts new frames in there with eggs and young brood. And so the workers are frantically trying to raise queens as fast as possible because if they don't, they may miss their window and then unable to raise a queen and they'll be queenless for the rest of their life. And so these emergency queen cells are typically a lot smaller because they're rushing it, and there's typically 10 or 20 because they want to raise as much as possible to raise a new queen. Supersedure cells, these are situations where there is a queen, but she's getting older. She's getting her egg laying capacity is getting lower. Their pheromones are wearing off, so the workers are deciding to usurp the queen. So they produce these supersedure cells. They're typically longer, so higher quality because the workers have more time. There are typically only a few of them, so instead of having 10 or 20, there may be 2 to 5 of these cells. And so if you start seeing these supersedure cells, but still queen in your colony, that's a sign your colony's trying to replace that queen. Now, swarm cells are when your colony is starting to swarm. So half the workforce and the old queen will fly off and form a new colony. And so if you start seeing a lot of these queen cells at the bottom of your frame, these are a sign that the colony is about to swarm. And so if you see these, and we'll talk about this more during swarm management, you might want to take some intervention as soon as possible. If they're open like this, there's probably a sign that your colony's gone and found a new home. So it's really important to understand what queen cells look like and what they actually mean because as a beekeeper, you can tell a lot by just inspecting the colonies and seeing what these queen cells are. Okay, so next is looking at brood diseases. And so, as sort of a bee detective, which beekeepers have to be, understanding what, healthy brood looks like versus unhealthy brood looks like. And I don't expect you as a first year beekeeper or a second year beekeeper to understand what the different diseases are, but it's really important to know what healthy brood looks like. And what And if it doesn't look healthy, then contact the apiary inspection service or myself to help diagnose the issue. And so this is what healthy brood looks like. So you can see it's white and pearly. You can see they're kind of this clear C shape, and there's not a lot of open spots. And so if it's kind of white and pearly like this is a good sign that you have healthy developing brood. If you see a lot of discoloration in the brood, so yellowish colors, you see scales, you see a lot of missing spots, maybe a little bit of brown, this is a sign that your colony is diseased. Now, in this particular situation, this was European foul brood. So it's one where you can actually get an antibiotic to treat, or maybe you can feed them to get them out of the European foul brood. But what this all means is if you see any discoloration or any issue with the brood, then alert somebody to help you figure out what the issue is. Because most of the diseases and most of the issues will be happening at the brood level. And so understanding what healthy brood looks like versus unhealthy brood looks like is really important. Now, from a queen perspective, what happens as the queen ages and gets older, she's laying less eggs, she has less control of the colony, and you see these colonies are more prone to some of these diseases. And so if you start seeing, queen with tattered wings, you see a poor brood pattern, you see supersedure cells, and you see a lot of diseases, this is really a major issue and some kind of queen issue. Okay, so I think we'll stop there with the queens, and I think we'll cover the rest next week. So we'll talk about drones, and we'll talk about workers next week. We'll talk about the social behaviors, and we'll cover a little bit about how honeybees differ from humans and how they the respiratory system, the circulatory system, and things like that. And so I'll be sending the recording immediately at this talk, and I'll send you that chapter. It's already in the Google Classroom, so you can read that beforehand. But it covers everything I talked about today, but also everything I'll talk about next week. Also, take that pre-test if possible. Please do not use Google. Just try to take it to the best of your ability. We just want to kind of see where everybody's at and the information they know and what they don't know. So it's really helpful for us to understand the baseline for everybody else. And with that, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat. Maybe okay.
Lady that was had a queen issue recently.
Okay.
She said that let's pull it back up. North Texas last Saturday afternoon, when temp was about 65, found the queen outside the hive on the ground on a paver with attendants around her, seemingly trying to get her to move, capture her, and put her back in the hive.
Mhm.
Why?
Well, when you put her back in the colony, were the workers kind of attacking her and biting at her, or were they accepting her? Sometimes I've seen queens that were put into the wrong colony, and then the workers immediately start attacking them. So I'm just curious. And we can unmute you too if you want to describe your situation. Was it Susan?
Can Susan, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, it was our queen. She's marked, and they didn't seem to be attacking her when we put her back in, but there were very few workers in the hive at the time also.
Hmm. Did you see like any queen cells in the hive?
No, we did a quick inspection and didn't see any queen cells. We only saw a very few brood, very spotty.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. I guess I guess there's a few options. So one, I guess during the inspection, maybe the queen accidentally fell off. Or two, maybe the colony was trying to abscond or swarm, and something happened to the queen, so she's unable to fly out. So I wonder, like when you're doing inspections, if the queen fell off, or maybe the colony was trying to abscond. I just don't know what the colony looked like beforehand. Like, was it really strong, and then it's really weak now?
Uh, We did an inspection 2 weeks ago when it was warm, and there were very few bees. She was in there. I don't think we knocked her off because that was 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And when we saw her on Saturday, she was just right underneath the hive.
Yeah, weird. I wonder if the colony tried to abscond. I'm not sure what the colony looked like beforehand, but yeah, maybe they tried to fly off. I don't typically see the queens leave the colony unless, the workers are trying to replace the queen and raise a new queen. Then they might try to like kick her out of the colony. But even that, they don't want to keep the queens alive. So that is kind of odd. And you said it was marked, so it must have came from that
Yes.
colony, right?
Yes.
Weird.
We only have one colony, so
Okay.
this is our first year.
Yeah, let me know how the queen's doing. So just see if she's laying eggs. So I guess that they must have accepted her, maybe. Have you looked
Well,
at it yet?
I haven't looked at her since Saturday,
Okay.
because it's been kind of cool. But
Yeah, yeah. Because one issue is if she's been sitting out for a long time, I'm not sure how long, but she could be damaged and just being
mhm,
exposed to the environment for a long period of time. I mean, you may want to consider requeening depending on how the queen looks and if she's
mhm.
actually laying eggs. Because I mean, I wonder, if the workers did kick her out, I'm wondering if like when you introduced her back, if they replaced her or killed her off. I don't know.
Mhm. Well, it did appear that she had a retinue around her when she was on the
Okay.
ground.
Okay. Yeah, that's really weird. I wonder if they tried abscond. I'm not quite sure. So I guess just keep track of egg laying and see what happened.
So this time of year, how much egg laying should we see?
It really depends on the area. So we've been monitoring our 10 colonies or so, and I guess if you can see me, we have a few brew patterns about this. And so the queen's laying, a few hundred eggs, I'd say. Not a lot, but she's starting to lay eggs. Now we're getting cold spells, so that'll probably dip down a little bit. But probably in the next week or so, the queen egg laying will start ramping up. And maybe certain areas you see a lot more egg laying. I just know East Texas, we've seen a little bit, but not a ton.
Okay, because I only saw maybe on the brood frame that I picked up, maybe 20 capped brood.
Okay. Yeah, and once it starts getting warmer, where are you located?
Uh, 10 miles north of Denton.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe if you give it like another week or so, when it starts warming up, I bet the queen will start ramping up her egg laying. But it also depends on like what's around. So, if the queen could be laying eggs, but the workers will cannibalize them if they don't have enough nutrients to feed them.
Right.
So I've actually seen a situation where the queen's laying eggs, and they'll come back the next day and they'll be cannibalized because there's no pollen or nectar out there. So
Hmm.
once it starts getting warmer, and your colony's not bringing any pollen or nectar, you can probably supplement them if you want to just to kind of ramp up the egg laying. It's kind of up to you.
Well, I do have a sugar board in there right now.
You do, okay. But typically they need pollen for egg laying. So if you want to feed them pollen, you can. But I'd say probably the next week or so, especially that northern dention area, they'll start bringing pollen pretty soon. So I
Okay.
know I know especially here next week they will. So I'd probably just kind of wait and see. Maybe think about purchasing a new queen if they're not laying eggs and just kind of monitor it over time.
Okay. I just found it very odd.
That is really odd. I've never seen that before, so that's very odd.
Well, thank you.
Okay, was there any other questions? I think you answered them all.
I,
Thanks so
the only
much.
question
Yes.
that I had was I missed a little bit of the first part. What's the deal with finding a recording of this later, and
Mhm.
also where's the test?
Yeah, so are you part of the Google Classroom? I think we invited everybody.
I wasn't here for the first hour, so
Okay.
maybe not.
Yeah, we will get you on the Google Classroom, and then all the materials will be on the Google Classroom. And so we'll have the pre-test on there, and then we'll have all the reading materials on the Google Classroom. But immediately after this, we'll send an email link to the recording and then the reading material for next week. But everything should be on the Google Classroom, so you can always go back and watch the recordings later on. These recordings
That's
will
a
be
link.
open for the. Sorry?
That's a link that you sent us or
Yeah, is
will
that the link
send,
sent?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one in here. I'm gonna also
because it's not in my email.
I'll repost the link in the chat. I'm about to do it right now.
Yeah, and if you have any issues, just let me know. But after this, we'll send an email with a link for the recording, and we'll send information about the reading material for next week. So we'll have everything in email, but also the Google Classroom.
Okay, thank you.
Chris had a question.
Yeah, good morning. During mating, does the queen mate with drones from the same colony and nearby colonies, or do the drones come from far away as well?
Yeah, so typically the females will kind of mate farther away from the colony, and the drones will mate closer to the colony. But it really depends. I mean, they really try to avoid each other to so there's no inbreeding within the colony. So, but queens are mating with 15 to 20 males, so they may mate with like a related male, for example, but then the rest are unrelated. So you may see some situations like that, but they really do try to avoid each other by flying different distances if possible.
Thank you.
Test
I have
and
a
us.
question. I have a question about the queens. We've done inspections and we never see the queen. We see evidence that the queen is there with the eggs and the brood and the hive's healthy, and we've gotten books on how to spot the queen. We apparently need help on spotting the queen.
Are your queens marked? That's the first question.
No, no.
No. Yeah, and so one way to make it easier, so I know just for myself, especially when I started beekeeping, it is really hard to find the queen. And you don't always have to find the queen. I mean, if I find eggs, then that's a good sign that there's actually active laying queen. But if you do want to find the queen, the easiest way is to mark her. I'm not sure what type of bees you have, but if you have kind of darker carniolan bees and all your bees are pretty black, it does make it harder to find the queens versus kind of lighter colored Italian queens. So it kind of depends on that. So I mean, there's really no clear guideline on how to find the queen. Like sometimes I'll pull out frames with eggs on it. I was like, the queen must be here. She's laying eggs. But then she'll be on a whole different frame. So she actually moves pretty fast across the frame. So it just takes a little bit of time. One thing I do typically if I can't find the queen is instead of look at the frames up like this, I kind of rotate them like this a little bit and kind of look at them from an angle. And to me, that makes it easier to find because I can see that the queen's a little bit larger. And so that might be one thing you want to try with some of the frames. But really, as long as you're seeing eggs and the brood pattern is looking really good, then you don't need to find the queen all the time. But marking is probably the easiest way for a new beekeeper.
Okay, and my next question is that the first time we went out, we used a smoker, and that just really seemed to anger the bees. So what we ended up doing was just using air.
Air?
And
Well,
air.
it depends. It
to
depends. Like
massage.
so how much smoke did you apply? So was it like a bellow of smoke, like a ton of smoke, or just a little bit of smoke? Because if you over smoke them, the bees will start leaving.
They all hung out on the outside,
Mhm.
on the front of the hive. We didn't realize that until we looked and went, oh, look at they're all there. And
Yep.
I don't think it was too much smoke, but after your question, and they actually went outside to get away from the smoke, maybe it was too much smoke.
Yeah, yeah. You only do like a few puffs of smoke. So I mean, if you start seeing a flame and you see like this bellowing smoke, like you see just a little smoke coming from the smoker, and to smoke them like 2 times. I never smoked them more than 2 times. If the bees start getting more aggressive, I smoked them a few times, but you can definitely over smoke them. And so if you smoke them and you open up a frame and all the bees are out the frame, that's a good sign that you over smoke them. And so yeah, just try not to have like a flame or a lot of smoke bellowing from the smoker. You can try like a liquid smoker too if you're not comfortable with it, but just try to use the least amount of smoke if possible.
Okay, because
Another
the air worked fine spread apart for us.
Jody was gonna add
another
something?
thing that smoke, yeah, another thing that smoke does is kind of helps with dampening down that alarm pheromone that they're spreading. I'm not sure if
Oh,
air would do the same thing. It might, but if you're smelling smoke instead of that alarm pheromone, you don't know that your house is getting ripped apart by some big giant human. Kind of,
that's a good
that,
point.
yeah.
What type of smoker fuel did you use?
Just twigs from around our property.
Okay. Yeah. We use pine needles, and sometimes when we start the pine needles up, they produce like a very, very thick smoke. So you want to try to use you don't want a thick smoke and over smoke the bees. But you
Okay.
still want to smoke them like Dodie mentioned, because if you're not, then you're not going to mass that alarm pheromone.
Okay.
Kim, where are you located?
Where am I located? Harwood, which is about 15 miles east of Luling.
I'm a little bit of a drive for you. You were the one that said you were having trouble finding queens, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I'd be happy if you wanted to come visit. One of my best tips is to put queen excluders in between the boxes so that you've narrowed your queen down to at least just one box. And then you can come back and divide all the boxes out, and the one box that has eggs in it a week later or 3 days later is the one that has the queens. So you know which one to look for.
And I hate to have a monopoly on this conversation, but then we actually made a mistake and it cost us a hive. We saw that the hive was, both hives were filling up beautifully. We hadn't quite gotten to 7 full frames, but we went ahead and put a queen excluder and a medium box on top, and we ended up with wax moths that totally destroyed one hive.
So you had a deep, and then you had queen excluder, and then the super on top.
Yeah. And
Okay.
that it was, we found out later it was too soon, that the bees had too much space to defend,
Yeah.
and it really just, oops.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, if you say you have 7 frames of bees, that really should be a problem for them to take care of the wax moths. So something must have happened to your colony where it got really small. Yeah, because if it's too small, they don't have enough workforce to go up there and take care of the colony. So
It wasn't quite
and
7. We just thought, oh, they're doing this to
sure.
save us time, and we put the other box on top, and
Yep.
it was too much for them.
Yeah, and kind of back to what Dodie mentioned about over smoking and finding the queen. Yeah, if you over smoke the colony too, that queen will start running everywhere, and so you'll see the queen like running to the bottom board, not the frame too. So if you're smoking it too much, it'll make the queen really hard to find. So that's why I just recommend take a few puffs of smoke, like light puffs, where the queen's not running around, and that should make it easier to find the queen.
Okay. Okay. And thank you. Sorry for monopolizing.
No, happy to answer any questions. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Okay, perfect. Well, you guys should all have my email, but I'm gonna put my email and then Heather can put her email in chat. So if you have any issues, let us know. But we'll be sending an email out here short with all the information. But if you can't get into the Google Classroom or have any issues, please let us know. We'll be trying to email all the information too, just to make it easier for everybody. I know working with the Google Classroom has been kind of a pain for us, so we're hoping to kind of streamline as much as possible. So, but if you have any questions, shoot us an email and just let us know.
Yeah.
Thank y'all.
You hear me? Getting coordinated with a bee club or a mentor that's already in the program. Feel free to reach out to us for that too. If you let us know where you're at, then we can find somebody close to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yep. Yeah, because there's like 60 some bee clubs across the state, and that's one great way. So I know Dodie's in the Austin area, but we have really great experienced beekeepers across the state. So we're happy to help. And yeah, if you guys have any issues with your colonies, if you have colonies already, just shoot us an email. We can schedule a phone call. You know, we're extensions. So we're here to help any way possible. So send us pictures or call us, and we can help out.
Is that the one we're picking the pizza from?
Well, no. No.
All right, perfect. Thank you. See you guys all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.